Hi, welcome to another episode of Let's Code DC. This time we are going to do server-side coding, and that is creating RESTful API using Lumen. We are not using Laravel, but Lumen, which is a lightweight platform to build RESTful APIs. So even before going to that, let me just start with the basics of it. So for creating RESTful API using Lumen, we are going to use Dingo framework. I had created a previous tutorial which was based on Laravel to create API using Dingo framework. This is more or less similar approach, but with the latest version of Lumen, and approach might be a slightly variant from whatever we have done earlier. So let's get started with it. First of all, we need to have the Lumen created. For Lumen, all you need to do is go to lumen.laravel.com, where you can find the documentation, and for the installation there are some prerequisites. We need a PHP version 7.0, all that. And for installation, if you want to have it available globally, I already have it, so I can do a composer global required. So composer is something which will let you install dependencies required. So if you are not sure about it, you can refer back one of my earlier tutorials where I will provide the links to that. And also make sure that when you're installing Lumen, make sure that it is within this vendor bin folder. So installation is as simple as going to terminal and then go to your I already have composer, so it's easier for me to navigate to that path. All I have to do is composer vendor bin, takes me to the bin folder, and I just need to execute the composer global required Laravel installation, which will install Lumen in your project, in your machine globally. The next step is to create the Lumen project. So this is the base for creating the Dingo. Even before integrating Dingo, first thing is to install the project, Lumen project, in your folder. So I have Lumen folder already created where I'll be installing. So I have the Lumen. I go into the Lumen projects, and then all I need to do is Lumen new and your project name. So mine is a sample API, so I'll call it Lumen new sample API. So that will create the project in your folder. If you go back, it is already been created, so you have the basic structure available. So as an IDE, for the editor tool that I'm going to use is Visual Studio Code, which is a free tool available from Microsoft. I'm a big fan of Visual Studio. I had a very good experience working with Visual Studio earlier on WPF and MVVM applications. So I had pretty much had a good experience with this. So I'm just using that same experience, but I have identified that this editor works well for many kinds of projects, like a Laravel or an Angular or React project. Anything works well. So this is my project structure. I already opened the sample API. This is my project structure for Lumen. It does not come with all the views and everything which are required in Laravel, because Laravel is more like a web framework. Lumen is more a REST API framework. So it will not come with all those bells and whistles which are needed for Laravel. So as a test, let's try running this project and see what goes on. So for running a Lumen project, once you have created it, you need to do a you need to run the project. So in Laravel, it used to be PHP artisan serve, if you are aware of it. If not, in the Laravel, you can check it in the Laravel version. But in the Lumen versions recently, they have, for running the serving your server locally, you have to run a command like this: PHP localhost and your port, and then include all this. It's just one thing which you need to run. So if I run it, I need to go inside the folder. So and then if I, so it's listening to that port 8000 right now. So if we just run say 8000, let's see what happens. It gives me some errors. That's because I have not updated my composer to install all the dependencies. So let me just stop this and then run a composer update. So before that, let me just pick up Ribbon. It must be there. So these are all the commands which I have already run. So all I need to do is run the composer update with no scripts. So this will update my packages which is already there as part of Lumen. This might take a while, so you can have a cup of coffee. So it did not take much time for me because I had it available in the cache, so it just loaded pretty soon for me. So if I run this again, let me just rerun the whole thing. Maybe run it in a different port. Let me run it in 8081. So now it's listening on 8081. So everything looks fine right now because it shows the Lumen 5 version 5.5.2 message. That means it has installed the latest version of Lumen and it's available for integration. The next step we need to start is integration of Dingo API. So their documentation, if you go to GitHub Dingo API, you'll find RESTful API package for Laravel and Lumen frameworks. So we are basically going to use Lumen right now because Laravel is something which is something which can be used, which serves better for a web project, but even it does not harm you if you're going ahead and creating a RESTful API using Laravel. But this is more like a trial where I am trying to create Lumen as a framework for creating my REST API. So the first step is installation. So you need to require this in your composer.json. So go to your project location and search for composer.json. This is my composer.json. So I'll just include the Dingo API in the require. So it's still in alpha 1 for Lumen. Or even for Laravel, latest Laravel version or Lumen, it's alpha version. So it's not yet stable, but once it is stable, this is where you can actually go ahead and pick up the latest version. And so to update it, let's again run composer update. So that should, if it's already there in your cache, it should install it pretty soon, or include that package pretty soon. So it's there in my cache, so it just included it. So as you can see, it is included and it suggests installation of newer packages, but let's leave it at it right now because whatever is required is already included. But it's good to keep a note of all these frameworks which it is asking to install for this to work well. So JWT auth is something we will use in the later tutorial to create auth layers REST APIs. So that's something pretty interesting, and it was pretty much well received in the Laravel tutorial, so you can expect something similar in the Lumen as well. So let's continue on building this one where I have already included the Dingo API. Now next is to include register the Dingo service providers. So for Laravel you need to do this and for the Lumen one we need to use the app register, this one. So go to bootstrap app.php, that's the folder, go there, and all you have to do is include it as the register somewhere here. That will be okay. And they are also asking us to include as optionals these two facades, which can also, if included, you can access the APIs using these facades, like the API as well as the routes. So we can also include that. So for including that, let's pick up a snippet. All that we need to do is to enable this with facades. Let's go there and uncomment this part and then have this included. So we are checking whether this this for JW auth, but for our sake we'll be using a couple of these facades API. So instead of time one, we replace that and then we'll call it Dingo API. So we are checking whether this class exists. If not, we are adding this type alias. Similarly, for the second one, we'll call it Dingo route, and that will have this route. So we have included both the facades right now. Let's see for any issues. Does not run again. Let's stop and see. So in 8081, so requested resource is not found on this server, it says. So let's continue on. Maybe just change this port and just to have a check. 8082, what happens? So we are pretty much getting the same kind of error. It's not found the resource, so it's more like the resource is not available right now. So let's keep working on this to configure and see whether things work. So nothing as such has broken on including these two, the service provider registration as well as the facade. So let's configure things now. So that is the next step, configuring the bootstrap php app.php file or your configuration file. So if you see, all of the configurations required will go into a file called .env. That's the environment file. So if you go back, you have something called as an environment.example, which we can rename and use. So this is our environment right now, the environment file. And even before that, let's include an app key, which is like 32 digit 32 character integer, so which I am just using to generate something, a new one. I'm using an online utility to generate it based on some parameters. So let me just include that. Still nothing there. And let's start with configurations. Go back to the configuration. So in Laravel, you had to publish a service provider app.php, which you might have used, but in Lumen you have to use the the environment file. So for that, first thing is to include API standards. I'm just keeping it VND, which stands for meant for projects that are publicly available and distributed. So if I'm distributing it, this API will be available for public usage. And then I'm using something called as a subtype, where I might just use my app name. Let me use that. I'm calling it sample app something. Prefixes, I'll be using the prefix API. That's like pretty much standard everywhere. And for the version, this being the first version, I'll use API versioning version 1. API versioning will make sense when you have multiple releases of the APIs being released to your clients, and then whenever there is a change happening, you will provision it through the API versions. So it will make sense when you are actually distributing it. And give an API name. So I'm calling it sample API. Conditional requests and all are caching features, which I'm not looking at right now for configuration, but required you can configure it to true and do stuff there later point. Strict mode, it's more like sending or receiving whenever a REST API receives a API call, whether it needs to include the accept header or not. If you are enabling that strict mode, then every API call should come with that header accept. So I'm not enforcing that right now. Authentication provider, I'm just keeping it as basic right now because we will be using different kinds of authentication in the future, JWT, OAuth2, basic and everything. We will see that in the later tutorials, but then currently I'm just keeping it as the basic, which is the default one. I'm not touching that. And then throttling rate limit, I'm not doing anything with that right now, but if I had to, I need to include it in the app.php bootstrap file, change those things. Response transform is something we have to take care when we include fractal, which is like a transformer, which will modify your data, the table data, before it's being sent through the REST API, so that the consumer which receives it will not actually know the data structure which is being designed, and whenever there is a change happening, there will change happening on the DB side, it will not affect anything on the consumer side, because everything will be transformed accordingly. So that's why we use transformers like Fractal. Response format by default will be JSON. We'll keep it as JSON in the configuration. Error format is something if you want to structure your messages in the errors with our own customizations, then we can include it in a format and then include it, not in the scope of this one, but we will definitely look into it at a later point. And then API debug. Pretty much we have all the configurations required right now available. Let's just try refreshing and see what's going on. Nothing as yet. So you might just have to see in some other port. Oh, that's because we are running it in the different folder, wrong folder. So we might have to go back and go to our folder. Pretty much it, and then let's run it in 8080. Let's see what goes on right now. So it was a mistake from my end. So we are pretty much there. Still everything is working fine, and then when we start doing something like introducing API, it gives me an error right now. It says the version given was unknown, has no registered routes. That means we have not yet registered any routes for it to handle our cases. So as a first step, let's go back and define Dingo routes. So that is the next step of creating API endpoints. So where we need to go first to the routes folder, routes.php. Maybe we can directly browse to that. You will find it in, I think right now it's in web.php. It used to be in routes. So now it's available through this web.php, I am assuming. So we will ignore these routes which are available. These are the default routes which actually shows you when you don't have anything. This is the one which shows you the version. That is what is being done here. But when we define our own routes right now, let's say first step is to include this, the Dingo dependency, Dingo API routing router. As soon as it is defined, next step is to define this one. These are like including the version, appending the version, and exposing the API. This is more like a dependency injection to the function as a param. So we are having the structure now, API version 1, and API is passed as a parameter to this function. We can have it with multiple, if you want to group to multiple versions, that's when you do version 1 and version 2. That's maybe scope for future. Middleware is something where you need to have a validation in place, then you will route all your queries through the middleware. So that is again out of scope for this, because this tutorial is basically to set up your Lumen for creating REST APIs. So this Lumina and Dingo for REST APIs. So now we are pretty much there where we will create our first API endpoint. So let's capture this, or maybe let's do this. Let's call $API, and then we'll just use a get. Get will accept a couple of parameters. And first parameter is our route, so it'll pretty much look like, let's call it hello, or maybe foo. It's a common way of doing it. And then let's create a function and then return hello world. So this is our first route, where it is routed through this version. When we call foo for this REST API, we should get hello world. Let's try that. See, we have this call version 1. It should give me not found exception. Now let's call foo. Does not give me anything. So we are routing it through API, and we call foo, we'll get hello world. So that's how it works. So let's go back to the configuration. So this is what the API is all about. The app API prefix we kept here is what is being taken there. If you remove it and see, it will not give you anything. And so prefix is required, just something you need to use. So we are back to the hello world. So we have successfully set up Dingo along with Lumen. Hope this was useful for you, and hope to see you soon with some more stuff with Lumen and Dingo in the future. Until then, have a great day.